700,000 men.
700,000. Big enough, you think?
Yes, absolutely. Because remember, we have never withdrawn from most of the Cold War garrisons that we've maintained around the world. We have aircraft sitting in northern Japan. We still have troops in Iceland. We've got forces in Germany. We've got forces all over the place, and we've been trying to push them further east into Poland and Romania and Bulgaria and places like this. Quite frankly, there's no rationale or justification for these forces anymore. The states that we formally provided defense to are now at least as rich and well off as we are and can easily defend themselves. And there is no detectable, tangible threat to them. So we don't need to maintain the vast overseas garrisons. We've never gone back and asked questions along the lines of, first of all, where are all the soldiers? What are they doing? I mean, we had more men in the United States Army in 1950, and the United States Army of 1950 couldn't fight its way out of a paper bag because most of that was a garrison constabulary force in Germany and Japan, riding on light vehicles and under strength in its combat formations. So the first thing you've got to do is say, we've got all these men, all of this manpower, but we don't seem to get much bang for our buck. Where are all the soldiers? We have generals galore inside the United States Army and the Marine Corps. We are increasingly like a South American military establishment with a surplus of 4-star and 3-star generals presiding in single service headquarters that we simply don't need. And these bureaucracies are bankrupting us. But we've got to retain what makes sense. We've got to retain capability. But the emphasis has to be on teeth, not useless overhead and not an extensive tail.
Well, what if someone made the argument? Let me make the argument. Well, you don't change a winning game.
Well, that is obviously the argument that the generals set forth to guarantee no change in the structure, organization, and modernization of the force after 91. I would argue that Desert Storm was not the great success story as presented to the American people. It was analogous to the high school football team taking on third graders and soundly defeating them, and then walking off the field thinking that they were the finest football team that had ever been fielded without having actually taken on anybody who was any good. And that was a mistake. The ultimate reason we went back into Iraq in 2003 was that the 1991 war was an unfinished war. We failed.
General Powell, General Schwarzkopf, every flag rank officer I know of would say, not only would they say that's wrong, but those would be fighting words as far as they're concerned.
Well, remember, the generals traded very heavily on this success story. And because the politicians were anxious to join what they saw as an easy victory bandwagon and wave the flag, we ended up rendering generals almost invulnerable to the point where we've eliminated accountability for generals. So that nothing that generals say is questioned. Nothing that generals want is challenged. And regardless of a history of almost continuous failure in both Afghanistan and Iraq, we have yet to remove a single senior officer. And I think this goes back to the 1991 war and the mythology created in the aftermath of that war, that something really great and stupendous had happened, that we had fought, as the generals like to call it, the 5th largest army in the world. But the truth was, no Arab army had taken on and defeated a European force since the Renaissance.
You're not suggesting, are you, that when we tell ourselves, as we've been telling ourselves, that the United States military is the greatest fighting force the world has ever known, that we're kidding ourselves?
Yes. I think that we have to be very, very careful about what we assume we can and cannot do. Because while we do many, many things very well, we have limitations. Those limitations are evident today in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We are an English-speaking democracy, and we do not look favorably upon long wars of attrition. In fact, we dislike them intensely, which is one of the reasons that Franklin Roosevelt ended World War II as quickly as he possibly could, and so did Truman. It's why Eisenhower ended the Korean War as completely as he possibly could under the best terms that he could get. He understood that we could not sustain long wars without endings in sight. And we seem to have forgotten that.
Do you think there's any chance of changing hearts and minds in the Middle East through changing regimes?
There is no chance of changing hearts and minds anywhere in the world today that is not European through military occupation.
That's a pretty radical view.
I don't think so. I think it stands the test of time and history. And I think if you look at the historical record, you will see that efforts to go into places like the Philippines, where we effectively waged genocidal warfare for several years, killed perhaps 100,000 Filipinos to bring the place under our control.
This was in very early 20th century.
Yeah, but it's, we did similar things tragically in Vietnam. We have gone into these non-European countries. Our occupations inevitably have created rebellions against us because our government is unwanted.
Can you describe what you would consider to be the ideal plan for reorganizing Army formations into groups based on specific capabilities to streamline Army command and control structures, and for that matter, the Marines as well?
People at the lowest level, at the tactical level, captains, sergeants, lieutenants, lieutenant colonels, majors, have to be in a position where they can make decisions on the basis of the information they have and the situation that is developing. We have resisted this because we have the citizen soldier model, which is a legacy of World War II and Vietnam, that says people at the lowest level are simply not capable of making these decisions. Therefore, all decisions must be elevated to the highest level, where the man with the most experience, who's a long-term service soldier, can review the facts and make the right decision. Well, that paradigm is irrelevant today. We have very capable people at the lowest levels. They don't need more supervision. They don't need micromanagement. They need more capability and greater independence and autonomy. So we've got to attack this very complex system of many, many echelons that separate the strategic level from the tactical. We need to compress those. One way to do that, in my view, was to eliminate in warfare the division organization and the brigade, and to essentially take away the division and the brigade and create a new intermediate formation, which you could call a battle group, whatever you would like to, but is commanded by a brigadier general with a robust staff. And that formation is 5,000 to 6,000 men, and it's either a maneuver formation, or it is a strike formation, or it is a support formation, or it's an intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance formation.
Isn't it, or is it true that the Army, particularly the Army, has already moved towards some of the reforms that you've outlined here?
What the Army generals did is that they looked at aspects that would not fundamentally change anything. In other words, they were interested in avoiding structural organizational changes that would have an impact on culture and promotion systems. And so they in their new mini brigade of about 3,500, they have 2 battalions. But otherwise, the staff structure is the same, and the formation is too small to operate independently.
Let's turn to something recent. Anbar province in Iraq.
Right.
Doesn't it, or does it, vindicate the light armor, highly mobile, intense civil affairs, integrated approach to occupation, as Secretary Gates suggested?
No. Let's look at what's actually happened in Anbar province. Thousands of Marines were killed and wounded in 2003, 2005, and into 2006. And then the Marine Corps leadership, along with the Navy Special Forces, your SEALs, began to notice that there was growing friction between Al-Qaeda, both indigenous and foreign, and the local tribal sheiks. And they began to question whether or not this was not an opportunity to reduce the casualties that the Marines, in particular the conventional forces, were taking by striking a deal with the Sunni sheiks. What we did is something that we could have done in 2003. We went to the sheiks and we said, listen, we'll essentially turn over control of the province to you. We'll let you stand up and arm your security forces. We'll back you, but we want your assistance in eliminating Al-Qaeda, which we know you also dislike. And oh, by the way, there will be handsome cash payments to you in the form of millions of dollars in hard cash. Sheikh.
Well, it worked.
And it worked, absolutely. And as I said, we could have done that in 2003, before Al-Qaeda even had a foothold in the country. There was never any requirement to occupy Anbar and govern it. But we should not interpret this